I became a single mother at 18. My parents demanded I give my baby up, then threw me out when I refused. After 20 years of silence, they and my golden child brother came back for my grandmother's house and the $780,000 she left me. In court, they smirked, like it was already theirs, until their own lawyer greeted me. "Good morning, prosecutor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth." The sharp click of designer heels against solid oak hardwood echoed through the quiet hallway of my grandmother Hattie's heritage home. I was kneeling on the floor, carefully wrapping a vintage tea set in newspaper, when the toe of a white leather pump suddenly slammed into the side of my cardboard box. I looked up to see Lauren, my brother DeAndre's wife, staring down at me with a look of absolute disgust. She crossed her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater and sighed loudly. "You need to gather this trash and get out of here by tonight, Kierra. DeAndre has a demolition crew arriving first thing tomorrow morning. We are tearing this ancient eyesore down to build luxury condos, so take your little memories and leave." I did not raise my voice. I simply placed another teacup into the box and smoothed the paper down. "I told you both last week that this house belongs to me now. Grandma Hattie left it to me in her will." A harsh laugh boomed from the doorway. DeAndre strolled into the living room wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. He walked right over my grandmother's hand-woven rug and slapped a thick legal document down on the coffee table. The bold letters across the top indicated it was a contested probate filing. "You actually think manipulating a senile old woman into leaving you $780,000, and this property changes who you are?" He mocked, leaning down so his face was level with mine. "You are a high school dropout who opened her legs for the first boy who looked her way. You are a complete embarrassment to the Vance name. You do not deserve a single dime of this estate, and my lawyers are going to make sure you walk away with absolutely nothing." I stood up slowly, brushing the dust off my tailored trousers. The air in the room felt thick with the same toxic superiority I had suffocated under 2 decades ago. But I was no longer the terrified 18-year-old girl who cried when they yelled. "A dropout," I asked, keeping my tone deadly calm. "Do you mean when you stole my $50,000 college fund to pay off your illegal sports bookie and Mom threw me out into the freezing snow because my pregnancy was a stain on the family? You drained my future to save your own skin. DeAndre and our parents let you do it because you were their golden boy." Before he could formulate a response, the front door opened again. My mother Yvonne and my father Marcus Sr. stepped into the house. My mother was dressed in her Sunday best, projecting the image of the perfect church event coordinator, while my father carried himself with the arrogant posture of a man who spent his life at the country club. My mother looked at the packed boxes and shook her head in sheer disappointment. "You have always been the stain on this family, Kierra," my mother said, not even bothering to say hello. "You brought us nothing but shame. Now you are trying to steal from your brother. Just sign the paperwork to surrender your rights to the estate. If you do this quietly, I will write you a personal check for $10,000 so you can pay for Jamal's tuition. Take the money and go back to whatever miserable life you have built. Do not humiliate us in court." I looked at the 4 of them standing there, a united front of arrogance and entitlement. They truly believed I was a desperate, uneducated woman who would crumble under their pressure. I picked up the heavy probate document from the coffee table. I looked DeAndre directly in the eyes, smiled sweetly, and ripped the thick stack of papers completely in half. I dropped the torn pieces onto the floor, right onto Lauren's expensive white shoes. "Keep your $10,000, I said smoothly. "We will see exactly who gets humiliated in front of the judge. Oh, and DeAndre, you might want to call American Express. Your corporate black card was just frozen this morning." DeAndre scoffed, rolling his eyes as he pulled out his phone. "You are delusional. My accounts are perfectly fine." But the sudden pale look on his face as he stared at his banking app told a completely different story. I picked up my box of teacups and walked right past them out the front door, leaving them standing in stunned silence. 2 nights later, the local community center was transformed into an opulent ballroom for the annual church fundraising gala. My mother was in her element parading DeAndre around the room as the ultimate community savior. She was loudly boasting to the pastor and the church elders about DeAndre's upcoming luxury real estate project, completely omitting the fact that the project was supposed to be built on my grandmother's stolen land. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung open and I walked in with my son Jamal. We were both wearing immaculate dark tailored suits that commanded immediate attention. Jamal stood tall and confident, radiating the kind of quiet power that came from knowing exactly who he was. We had barely taken 10 steps into the room before Lauren spotted us and made a beeline for our direction, a venomous smile plastered on her face. "Well, look who decided to crash the event," Lauren sneered, looking Jamal up and down with obvious disdain. "Wow, you actually made it out of the hood and got into Howard University. Affirmative action is really working overtime these days, isn't it?" The sheer audacity of her microaggression made the surrounding guests turn their heads. The pastor's wife, who was standing nearby, gasped softly. But Jamal did not lose his composure for a single second. He adjusted his suit jacket, looked Lauren right in the eye, and smiled politely. "Actually, my acceptance was based on my 4.0 grade point average and my early admission into the advanced financial analytics program," Jamal replied, his voice ringing out clearly. "And since you seem so interested in my education, perhaps you would prefer we converse in French." Jamal immediately switched to flawless, sophisticated French, complimenting the pastor's wife on her beautiful gown and thanking her for the invitation to the gala. Lauren stood there with her mouth hanging open, completely unable to understand a single word he was saying. Her face turned a bright shade of red as she realized she had just been intellectually dismantled by a 20-year-old college student in front of the most influential people in our community. The pastor's wife beamed at Jamal, completely ignoring Lauren's presence. My mother, having witnessed the entire humiliating exchange from across the room, marched over and grabbed my arm. She dragged me away from the crowd and into a secluded corner near the large bay windows, her fingernails digging painfully into my sleeve. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You are ruining everything. Do you know DeAndre is trying to secure a massive investment from the church elders tonight? You are deliberately trying to destroy his chances with your presence. Why do you always have to be such a careless mistake?" I pulled my arm free from her grasp, smoothing down the fabric of my jacket. "I am not ruining anything, Mom. DeAndre is doing a perfectly fine job of destroying his own life without any help from me." My mother glared at me, her chest heaving. "DeAndre is a successful, wealthy businessman who actually contributes to this family. He has an image to maintain. He has a pristine reputation. You are just jealous because you will never have what he has." I did not argue. I simply turned and pointed out the large glass window toward the valet parking area at the front entrance of the venue. DeAndre's prized custom black Mercedes G-Wagon was currently hitched to the back of a heavy-duty repossession tow truck. Two men in high-visibility vests were securing the chains, completely ignoring DeAndre, who was sprinting out of the building and waving his arms frantically in the middle of the street. Dozens of gala guests had gathered by the windows, pointing and whispering, as the golden child of the Vance family publicly lost his most recognizable status symbol. "You are so worried about his pristine reputation?" I said quietly, leaning in close to my mother's ear. "Well, you might want to go explain to the pastor and the church elders exactly why your wealthy, successful son just had his car repossessed by a finance company right in the middle of your fancy fundraising gala." My mother let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she watched the tow truck pull away into the night, dragging DeAndre's pride and joy behind it. I gave her one last polite smile, turned on my heel, and walked back into the ballroom to enjoy the rest of the evening with my son. The maitre d' led me through the dimly lit dining room of L'Etoile, a restaurant where the appetizers cost more than my first month of rent when I was a struggling teenager. I spotted them immediately. My father, Marcus Sr., sat at the head of a private velvet booth, radiating an unwarranted sense of authority. To his right sat my mother, Yvonne, clutching her signature pearls alongside my brother DeAndre and his wife, Lauren. To my father's left sat a man I did not recognize. He wore a cheap suit, trying desperately to look expensive. I calmly slid into the empty leather chair opposite my father, carefully smoothing the pristine skirt of my tailored suit. Nobody offered a greeting. My father pointed a manicured finger at the stranger. Kierra, this is Gary. He is the best probate attorney in the state. We brought him here to make things simple for you. Gary leaned forward, folding his hands on the crisp white tablecloth. He adjusted his silk tie and cleared his throat with a practiced, arrogant sound. He had the kind of smile that made you want to check your wallet. Let us cut to the chase, Kierra. You have been estranged from this family for 20 years. You have absolutely no financial or legal resources. We know you had a child out of wedlock at 18. If you do not sign this settlement agreement right now, turning over Hattie's house and the $780,000 to DeAndre, I will personally subpoena every welfare record, food stamp application, and housing assistance form you have ever filed. I will stand in front of a judge and paint you as a destitute, unfit mother who preyed on a vulnerable old woman. I picked up my crystal water glass and took a very slow, deliberate sip. The sheer arrogance radiating from them was almost suffocating. Lauren leaned over her plate of imported caviar, swirling her expensive wine glass. You really should listen to him, Kierra. My family plays golf with the probate judge every Sunday. Do you actually think a woman with your background is going to win in his courtroom? The justice system works for people like us, not people from your neighborhood. You are entirely out of your league. Take the money and go back to your housing project before you embarrass yourself in front of people who actually matter in this city. My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy as she reached across the table to pat DeAndre on the arm. We are offering you $50,000 now. That is more money than you have ever seen in your entire life. You have always been the stain on this family. Do not make us drag that stain into a public courtroom. We will destroy whatever miserable little life you have managed to scrape together over these past 2 decades. I looked directly at my mother. You mean like how you destroyed my life when you threw me out into the freezing winter because I refused to hide my pregnancy? You cared more about your country club status than your own daughter. Marcus Sr. slammed his heavy fist down on the table, violently rattling the crystal glasses. Sign the settlement, Kierra. You are a mistake. You have always been a mistake. You have no education, no power, and Lauren's family plays golf with the judge. You cannot win. You are nothing but a high school dropout who got lucky with a senile old woman's will. DeAndre is building a legacy for the Vance name. You are just standing in the way of progress. DeAndre smirked aggressively, adjusting his heavy gold Rolex to make sure I saw how successful he was. It is over, Kierra. Gary already filed the preliminary injunction. You cannot touch a single dime of that money, and you definitely cannot afford a lawyer to fight us. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply raised my hand and signaled the waiter. The young man hurried over, presenting the leather-bound check folder. The bill for their lavish dinner came to exactly $1,500. My parents looked at me, expecting me to panic, expecting me to beg them to pay for it. Instead, I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a sleek, heavy metal credit card. I placed it onto the tray. The waiter nodded and walked away. Gary narrowed his eyes at me, scoffing loudly. Maxing out your credit cards just to look tough is a pathetic strategy. You will be bankrupt by tomorrow morning. I leaned across the table, resting my elbows on the white linen. The waiter returned, handing me the receipt and my card. I left it face up on the table, just long enough for Gary to read the silver lettering stamped across the front. Department of Justice, United States Federal Government. Gary froze. The smug smile instantly slid off his face. His eyes darted from the card to my face, sheer panic suddenly flashing in his pupils. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a sharp whisper meant only for him and my brother. Mr. Gary, advising a client to build luxury condos on uncleared state land is not just stupid, it is federal wire fraud. And funneling investors' money through Lauren's dummy shell companies across state lines elevates it to a racketeering violation. DeAndre scoffed, looking completely confused. What are you talking about? But Gary was not looking at DeAndre. Gary was looking at me, his face draining of all color, until he looked completely sick. He recognized the card. He recognized the highly specific and terrifying legal terminology. He recognized that he had just threatened a federal agent. I slid the card back into my pocket. Thank you for dinner. I suggest you all take your time and enjoy the delicious dessert. It might be the last expensive meal you have for a very long time. I left them sitting in the silence of that dining booth. The night air felt like a cleansing breath as I drove back to the house. The property stood in the dark, a sanctuary holding more history than my family wanted to admit. I bypassed the cardboard boxes in the living room and walked straight down the hallway to her master bedroom. My heels clicked against the hardwood floors, matching the steady rhythm of my racing heart. Before she passed away, Grandma Hattie managed to send an envelope to my federal office. It was a single handwritten page instructing me to look beneath the heavy oak vanity where she used to keep her sewing kits. She wrote that the truth about the Vance family legacy was buried right there in the foundation. I pushed the heavy oak vanity aside, the old wood groaning in protest against the floorboards. I knelt down, running my fingers along the seams of the planks until I felt a slight give. I retrieved a flathead screwdriver from my bag and wedged it into the tight groove. With a sharp pull, the wooden plank popped loose, kicking up a sudden cloud of thick dust. Inside the shallow cavity lay a thick, cracked leather ledger wrapped tightly in plastic to protect it from moisture. I pulled it out and turned on the bedside lamp. The moment I opened the binding, the meticulously recorded handwriting of my grandmother revealed the absolute rot festering beneath my parents' country club smiles and church choir donations. Page after page detailed an intricate web of financial fraud that made my stomach turn. For the past 5 years, my brother DeAndre had been systematically siphoning money from the church's senior citizen retirement fund. He did not act alone. The ledger proved that my mother Yvonne used her position as the church event coordinator to grant him unrestricted access to the financial accounts. My father Marcus Sr. approved the forged accounting audits using his elite fraternity connections. Together, they allowed DeAndre to embezzle over $2 million from the hard-working elderly members of their own congregation. But the money trail did not stop there. Hattie had tracked exactly where the stolen funds went. DeAndre funneled the $2 million directly into a complex network of commercial dummy corporations. Every single one of those shell companies was registered entirely under Lauren's maiden name. My brother and his arrogant wife had built their entire luxury real estate empire on the stolen life savings of my parents' congregation. My parents knew everything. They turned a blind eye and actively facilitated the theft simply to keep up the appearance of having a wealthy, successful son. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a final note written on a piece of vintage stationery. Grandma Hattie wrote that she figured out the scheme too late to stop it, but she gathered enough evidence to ensure justice would eventually find them. She explicitly stated that throwing me out into the cold at 18 was the cruelest thing my parents ever did, but it ultimately saved my soul. Because I was cast out, I was the only Vance who remained completely untouched by their sickening greed. That was why she left me the house and the $780,000. It was not a random act of a senile woman. It was a deliberate, calculated move to place the weapons of their destruction directly into the hands of the only person strong enough to use them. A sudden violent crash shattered the quiet night. The sound of splintering wood echoed from the front porch, followed by the heavy thud of solid metal striking concrete. I quickly shoved the ledger into my briefcase, locked it tight, and walked toward the front window. Peeking through the curtains, I saw DeAndre standing on the front steps, panting heavily. The panic from the restaurant had evidently mutated into blind, reckless rage. He gripped a massive steel sledgehammer tightly in both hands. His designer suit jacket was tossed carelessly on the front lawn, his expensive tie loosened, his eyes totally wild with desperation. He swung the sledgehammer back and smashed it directly into the vintage wooden porch railing. The wood exploded into sharp splinters that scattered across the yard. "Come out here, Kierra," he screamed into the night, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You think flashing a fake government card makes you untouchable? You think you can steal my inheritance and walk away from me?" He swung the sledgehammer again, completely destroying the other side of the railing. The heavy thud severely shook the front door. "You are nothing but a stain, Kierra. Do you hear me? You are a terrible stain on this entire family. You are a careless mistake who should have stayed in the gutter. If it was not for me and my money, this house would already be a pile of ash. I am the one who built this family name. You cannot take what is mine." He was sweating profusely, pacing back and forth across the grass like a cornered animal. He raised the hammer to strike the front door, shouting loud threats about how Lauren's family would ensure I spent the rest of my miserable life in a federal prison for forging Grandma's legal will. He was completely unraveling, entirely unaware that he had just practically confessed his deep terror of federal involvement. I stood in the dark hallway watching his pathetic, angry tantrum. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have dialed the local police department and begged for a patrol car to stop a violent intruder. But local police would just write a misdemeanor vandalism ticket and let him post easy bail by tomorrow morning. I needed a permanent solution. I pulled out my encrypted government cell phone. "Agent Miller, execute the full federal raid on Vance. I finally have the master ledger." I ended the secure phone call and slipped the encrypted mobile device back into my pocket. Outside the window, DeAndre had finally exhausted himself. He dropped the heavy sledgehammer onto the ruined wood of the porch, kicked over a potted plant, and stumbled back to his vehicle. I watched his taillights disappear down the dark street. He wrongly thought breaking some porch wood would finally break my spirit. He had no idea his entire empire was about to be dismantled by dawn. The next morning began with a phone call that shattered the quiet sanctuary of Grandma Hattie's house. It was Jamal. His voice was remarkably steady, but I could hear the tight, controlled anger vibrating underneath his words. He was calling from the administrative building at Howard University. He had been pulled directly out of his advanced macroeconomics seminar by campus security. A concerned citizen had placed a series of frantic, highly detailed phone calls to the university disciplinary board and the local authorities. The caller claimed to have definitive proof that Jamal was running a narcotics ring out of his dorm room. Because of the university's strict zero-tolerance policy, his academic scholarship was immediately suspended, pending a full formal investigation. I tightly gripped the cold edge of the kitchen counter. A concerned citizen. The phrasing reeked of Lauren. She knew she could not intimidate me with lawyers, and she knew DeAndre's brute force had failed. So she reached for the most dangerous toxic weapon in her arsenal. She weaponized her privilege and weaponized racial stereotypes against a young, successful black man. She knew exactly what kind of permanent damage a drug accusation could do to a black student's pristine record, even a completely fabricated one. They realized I was not going to fold, so they decided to destroy my son's entire future to force my hand. I did not panic. Panic is solely reserved for weak people who do not know how to fight back. I locked the ledger in my federal transport safe, changed into a sharp crimson suit, and drove straight to the Oak Ridge Country Club. This was the crown jewel of my mother's social existence. It was a place built on the strict enforcement of respectability politics, where the elite gathered to sip mimosas, compare stock portfolios, and pretend their families were absolutely flawless. I confidently bypassed the front valet, parked my car myself, and walked past the mahogany double doors of the main dining hall. The Sunday brunch rush was in full swing. I spotted them immediately. My mother was holding court at a prime table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by her wealthy church friends. Lauren sat right beside her, delicately slicing into a crepe, looking entirely too pleased with herself. DeAndre was noticeably absent today, highly likely scrambling to deal with the federal agents currently tearing his office apart, though my mother clearly had no idea about that yet. I walked directly to their table. The polite chatter around them died down instantly as the women at the table took in my presence. My mother's smile hardened into a rigid, furious line. She quickly excused herself to her friends, grabbed my wrist with a vice-like grip, and dragged me out to the private terrace. Lauren followed right behind us, crossing her arms and wearing a smug, victorious expression. "Are you completely out of your mind coming here?" my mother hissed, checking over her shoulder to make sure her friends were not watching. "You do not belong at this club, Kierra. You are causing a scene." I quickly brushed her hand off my arm. "Call off your vicious little daughter-in-law. I know she made the anonymous calls to Howard University this morning. You are trying to strip Jamal of his full scholarship with fake drug charges." Lauren let out a short, mocking laugh. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. But honestly, are you surprised? The apple does not fall far from the tree. You were a teenage runaway who got knocked up in an alley. Why would your son be any different? He probably realized he could not keep up with the smart kids and went back to his natural instincts." My mother stepped between us, her eyes flashing with cold, calculated cruelty. "Let us be honest, Kierra. A delinquent child raising another delinquent. It was only a matter of time before his true nature showed. You have been a stain on this family since the day you refused to give that baby up. You ruined my reputation 20 years ago, and now your son is proving me right. But I can fix this. You know I have deep connections with the alumni board at Howard. I can make a few discreet phone calls. I can smooth over this entire unfortunate misunderstanding, and your boy can go right back to his classes tomorrow morning. All you have to do is drive to the lawyer's office right now, sign Grandma Hattie's estate over to DeAndre, and hand me the keys to the house. Do that, and Jamal gets his future back. Refuse, and he gets expelled today." They stared at me, waiting for the tears, waiting for the desperate surrender they had grown so accustomed to demanding from everyone else. They thought they had finally found the leverage to break me. They thought threatening my son was the winning move. I slowly smoothed the lapels of my crimson suit. I did not shed a single tear today. I did not beg. I simply looked directly at my mother, then shifted my gaze to Lauren's arrogant, smiling face. "You really should have consulted a competent lawyer before picking up that phone," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "You just committed extortion and witness tampering across state lines. See if your expensive country club membership covers federal bail bonds." I turned on my heel and walked out of the Oak Ridge Country Club, leaving my mother and Lauren sitting in stunned silence. The threat paralyzed them, but DeAndre was desperate. By Tuesday morning, his panic manifested into a public spectacle. My phone buzzed with an alert from a community news stream. DeAndre had hastily organized a press conference on the front steps of our family church. I drove straight there with Jamal in the passenger seat. We parked across the street, watching the circus unfold from the privacy of my tinted windows. DeAndre stood at a podium adorned with the church logo, wearing a crisp charcoal suit, projecting the image of a selfless community leader. My father stood stoically to his right, while my mother dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. "I stand before you today, not just as a businessman, but as a devoted son of this parish." DeAndre projected his voice powerfully into the microphone. "My beloved grandmother Hattie left behind an estate of $780,000. It was always her deepest wish and my solemn promise to her that this money would be used to build the Hattie Vance Youth Empowerment Center right here on these hallowed grounds. Unfortunately, that dream is currently being held hostage." He continued, his tone shifting into deep sorrow. "My estranged sister Kierra ran away from this family 20 years ago. She chose a life of rebellion and delinquency. Now she has suddenly returned, armed with a fraudulent legal claim, attempting to steal this money for her own selfish greed. She wants to rip this youth center away from our children. She is refusing to release the funds to the church. We tried to welcome her back into the fold," my mother said, her voice trembling beautifully. "We offered her forgiveness. We offered her financial help, but some stains cannot be washed away. She is willing to destroy this community just to spite the family that loved her. Sitting inside the car, Jamal gripped the dashboard, his knuckles turning white. His jaw was clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter. "Are you actually going to let them do this?" Jamal asked, his voice shaking with furious disbelief. "They are standing on the church steps, lying to the entire neighborhood. They are using Grandma Hattie's name to cover up the $2 million they already embezzled from the retirement fund. Mom, you have the badge, you have the authority. Walk out there right now and arrest him. Show them all who you really are. Make them choke on their lies." I kept my eyes fixed on the podium, watching DeAndre answer a reporter's question with a slick, practiced smile. "Why not? They are turning the whole city against you. They are painting you as a thief, while they are the ones running a federal Ponzi scheme." "Because federal prosecution is not about winning a shouting match on a sidewalk," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "If I walk out there right now and flash my badge, DeAndre will panic. He will immediately call his offshore bankers and try to scrub the digital paper trail before I can freeze the accounts. Lauren will start shredding the dummy corporation documents. I do not just want to embarrass them, Jamal. I want to dismantle them. I want every single piece of their fraudulent empire seized by the United States government. To do that, I need them to feel completely safe. I need them to believe their fake press conference actually worked. Arrogance is a blindfold, and right now your uncle is entirely blind." "So what is the next move?" he asked. "We let them celebrate," I said, shifting the car into drive and pulling away from the curb, and then we dropped the hammer. Later that evening, the house was completely silent. I sat behind the heavy mahogany desk in my secure home office. The walls were lined with law books and framed commendations from the Department of Justice. A stark contrast to the uneducated dropout narrative my family was desperately trying to sell to the public. The soft glow of my desk lamp illuminated the thick stacks of financial documents I had extracted from Grandma Hattie's hidden leather ledger. I had spent the last 8 hours cross-referencing DeAndre's fake real estate ventures with the church bank accounts. The evidence was absolute, undeniable, and utterly damning. The door to my office clicked open. Jamal walked in carrying my locked, reinforced government briefcase. He set it down gently on the center of the desk, tracing his fingers over the gold federal seal embossed on the top leather panel. He unlocked the dual combination latches and popped the lid open. Inside rested 3 pristine, newly printed documents. They were not civil lawsuits or probate disputes. They were federal criminal indictments fully drafted and approved by the United States Attorney General's office. Jamal carefully slid the 3 documents across the polished mahogany surface, lining them up perfectly in front of me. The first indictment bore DeAndre's name for federal wire fraud and embezzlement. The second carried Lauren's name for money laundering and conspiracy. The third carried my mother and father's names for aiding and abetting a federal financial crime. I opened my desk drawer and took out a heavy gold fountain pen. It was the same pen the Attorney General had gifted me when I was promoted to head of the Financial Crimes Division. Jamal stood beside my chair, watching intently. "They think you are just a girl they threw away," he said softly. I uncapped the gold pen and pressed the sharp nib against the bottom line of the first federal indictment. "They are about to find out exactly who they threw away," I replied. I took a deep breath to steady my nerves. I signed my name with a smooth, decisive stroke, sealing the fate of the Vance family forever. The fluorescent lights of the downtown probate deposition room hummed with a sterile, unforgiving energy. The court reporter sat at the head of the long oak table, her fingers hovering over the stenograph machine, ready to capture every humiliating detail my family had paid top dollar to put on the public record. Across from me sat Gary, his cheap cologne masking the sweat of a man who thought he had an easy kill. In the corner of the room, positioned perfectly in my line of sight, sat my mother, Yvonne. She wore her Sunday church suit, her posture rigid with righteous indignation, arms crossed tightly over her chest. My father, Marcus Sr., sat beside her, checking his heavy gold watch, as if this formal destruction of his daughter was simply a minor inconvenience in his busy schedule. They had orchestrated this entire legal theater to break me down to force me into handing over my rightful inheritance to my fraudulent brother DeAndre. Gary leaned across the table, tapping a silver pen against a thick stack of fabricated character assessments. For the record, Miss Vance, let us establish your baseline competency to manage an estate valued at nearly $1 million. He did not bother to hide the sneer pulling at the corner of his mouth. He was performing for his paying clients, putting on a show of aggressive legal superiority. Is it true that you were evicted from your family home at the age of 18 because you became pregnant out of wedlock? Did your parents not ask you to leave because your reckless behavior threatened their standing in the community and created an intolerable burden on their household? I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a flinch. That is a creative interpretation of being thrown into the freezing street for refusing to abort my child, I replied evenly, my voice betraying no emotion whatsoever. Gary paced to the side of the table, making sure his voice carried clearly for the court reporter. Let the record reflect that the deponent admits to being a teenage mother who burdened her prominent family with a careless mistake. He spat the words out, looking directly at my mother for approval. He was deliberately using the exact psychological triggers they had undoubtedly fed to him during their strategy meetings. From her seat in the corner, Yvonne caught my eye. Her lips moved silently, forming the exact same phrase that had haunted my entire adolescence. Stain on the family. She mouthed the words slowly, her eyes burning with a toxic mix of hatred and triumph. She genuinely believed that stripping my dignity in a legal setting would finally force me to surrender Grandma Hattie's house and the $780,000. She thought the shame of my past would be enough to make me run away, just like I did 2 decades ago. Gary returned to his chair and aggressively flipped open a file folder, spreading several papers across the polished wood. Let us move to your educational background, or rather the complete lack of one. You are sitting here demanding control over a highly complex financial estate. Yet according to our records, you failed to complete your senior year of high school. You are a high school dropout. He slammed the folder shut for dramatic effect, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Tell me, Miss Vance, how exactly does an uneducated, destitute teenage mother intend to manage a real estate property and a massive financial portfolio without losing every single dime? Do you honestly expect a probate judge to hand over an estate of this magnitude to a woman who cannot even produce a basic high school diploma? You have spent your life in the gutter while your brother built a real estate empire. You are completely unqualified to handle this level of wealth. The silence in the deposition room was heavy, broken only by the rapid clicking of the court reporter's machine. My father let out a quiet, mocking chuckle from his corner seat, whispering something to my mother about how fast I was going to fold under the pressure. They wanted a reaction. They wanted the frightened, crying 18-year-old girl who used to beg for their love and validation. They desperately wanted the helpless scapegoat they remembered. I slowly unclasped the brushed metal locks of my leather briefcase. I did not break eye contact with Gary as I reached inside, feeling the crisp edges of the documents I had prepared specifically for this moment. You are making quite a few assumptions for a man billing $600 an hour, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, authoritative register that made the court reporter pause for a fraction of a second to look up at me. Gary let out a short, arrogant laugh, adjusting his expensive silk tie. I am dealing in documented facts, Miss Vance. You have no formal education and absolutely zero financial literacy. You are entirely unfit to serve as the executor of Hattie Vance's estate. You cannot fight us on this. I pulled a thick, sealed, certified envelope from my briefcase and placed it deliberately in the dead center of the table, right on top of his fabricated character assessments. I suggest you open that before you make another statement on the official record, I instructed, maintaining my steady gaze. Gary rolled his eyes, snatching the envelope and tearing the top open with exaggerated annoyance. He pulled out the heavy watermarked parchment inside. As his eyes scanned the embossed seal at the top of the page, his arrogant smirk instantly vanished. His hands actually began to tremble, making the thick paper shake visibly in the quiet room. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very sick. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the oak table. My Harvard Law transcripts graduating summa cum laude, I stated loudly, making sure the court reporter caught every single syllable. You will also notice my specialized certifications in forensic accounting and federal tax law. I believe that more than covers my basic financial literacy to manage my grandmother's estate. A loud gasp echoed from the corner of the room. My mother shot up from her chair, her designer purse sliding off her lap and crashing loudly to the floor. My father turned ghost white, his jaw dropping open in utter disbelief. Gary could not speak. He just stared at the prestigious university seal, his mouth opening and closing in complete shock. But I was not finished dismantling his entire career. I pulled a second, much thinner document from my briefcase and slid it directly across the table until it touched his trembling fingers. And the second document is a bank trace proving your retainer was paid using stolen church funds. You are officially an accessory, Gary. Gary dropped the bank trace document like it was coated in poison. He shoved his chair back from the deposition table, grabbed his leather briefcase, and practically sprinted out of the room without looking back at my parents. My mother Yvonne clutched her chest, struggling to breathe as the reality of my resources finally crashed down on her. My father Marcus Sr. stood frozen. I calmly packed up my Harvard transcripts, snapped my briefcase shut, and walked out. But people like my parents do not surrender when they are cornered. They double down on the only currency they have left, which is their social standing. By Saturday evening, my encrypted phone intercepted a frantic digital trail. Yvonne had invoked her status as the head of the event committee to call an emergency closed-door meeting with the church elders before Sunday service. Her goal was clear. She intended to officially excommunicate me from the congregation, branding me as a spiritually lost, vindictive liar who was trying to extort her righteous brother. If she could isolate me from the community first, she believed no one would listen to my accusations about the stolen retirement funds. Sunday morning arrived with crisp, brilliant sunlight. The first Zion Fellowship was a cornerstone of the Black elite in our city. The parking lot was packed with luxury vehicles. Inside the sanctuary was a sea of tailored suits and extravagant church hats. I wore a sharp ivory suit flanked by Jamal, who looked incredibly striking in his tailored navy blazer. We did not slip quietly into the back pews. We walked directly down the center aisle, our footsteps synchronized, echoing softly against the marble floors. My mother was standing near the altar, whispering urgently into Pastor William's ear. When she saw me approaching, her eyes widened in sheer panic. She frantically waved her hand at the audiovisual booth in the balcony, signaling the sound technicians to cut the main microphones. She rushed to the edge of the altar steps, blocking my path. "You have no right to be in this sanctuary," Yvonne hissed, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "You are a stain on this family and a stain on this holy house. We are praying for your troubled soul, but you need to leave right now before security escorts you out." I did not stop walking. I easily bypassed her, stepping right up onto the carpeted altar. The congregation murmured, a wave of whispers rolling through the packed pews. DeAndre and his wife Lauren were sitting in the second row. DeAndre looked like he was going to vomit right there on the velvet cushions. Pastor William stepped forward, raising his hands to calm the congregation. "Sister Kierra, this is highly irregular. Your mother informed the board that you are dealing with some severe personal struggles and attempting to harm your brother's business." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick-bound copy of Grandma Hattie's financial ledger. I bypassed the dead microphone on the podium and stepped right to the edge of the stage, projecting my voice so every single person in the massive room could hear me clearly. For 20 years, my mother has told this congregation that I was a runaway, a delinquent, and a careless mistake. I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. She told you I was a stain on the Vance family because I became a teenage mother. But she never told you that she threw me out into the freezing snow because I refused to abort my child to protect her country club reputation. And she definitely never told you how she has been funding her lavish lifestyle for the past 5 years. Yvonne screamed from the floor, waving her arms wildly. "Do not listen to her. She is a sick, jealous liar. Turn on the choir music. Somebody stop her." I turned directly to Pastor Williams and pressed the heavy ledger into his hands. "I suggest you open that, Pastor. It is a meticulous accounting record kept by my late grandmother, Hattie Vance. It details exactly how my brother DeAndre emptied over $2 million from the church senior citizen retirement fund. It shows exactly how my mother used her position on the finance committee to authorize those transfers. And it proves that my father, Marcus Sr., falsified the annual audit reports to hide the missing money from this congregation. A collective gasp ripped through the sanctuary. Elderly church members, people who had poured their meager life savings into that retirement fund, began standing up in their pews demanding answers. Pastor Williams opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the first few pages. His hands began to shake visibly as he recognized the forged signatures and the matching dates of the missing church funds. Lauren jumped up from her pew, her face flushed red with furious indignation. "This is a complete fabrication. DeAndre is a legitimate real estate developer. We are building a youth center for this community. You people should be thanking us instead of listening to this uneducated ghetto trash." Jamal stepped forward, towering over Lauren from the edge of the altar. "You might want to lower your voice, Lauren. Every single dummy corporation DeAndre used to wash that stolen church money is registered entirely under your maiden name. You are the sole managing director of the fraudulent companies." DeAndre grabbed Lauren's arm, desperately trying to pull her back into the pew, but the damage was done. The crowd was turning on them. Dozens of angry congregants were shouting, demanding to know where their retirement money had gone. Marcus Sr. lost it completely. His face twisted into pure rage. He leaped out, ignoring all decorum. As Marcus Sr. charges the altar to drag Kierra away, the sanctuary doors swing open. IRS criminal investigation agents enter the church to seize the financial records. DeAndre managed shutting down his entire fake empire right in front of the entire stunned congregation, holding federal search warrants up high. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary slammed shut behind the federal agents, carrying out boxes of financial records. The congregation was in an absolute uproar. Elderly church members were shouting at my father, demanding their retirement money back. DeAndre looked like a cornered rat, his tailored suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big, as he watched his entire fraudulent empire dissolve into federal evidence. He grabbed Lauren by the arm and shoved his way through the side exit, fleeing the very community he had sworn to uplift just 24 hours ago. My mother was weeping on the altar, completely abandoned by her wealthy friends. I did not stay to watch them scramble. Jamal and I walked out of the church, the bright Sunday sun warming our faces, and drove straight back to Grandma Hattie's house. I needed to prepare the final federal asset freeze paperwork for Monday morning. I should have known a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind of threat. They had lost their public standing, their church immunity, and their dummy corporations, but they still had one desperate, reckless play left in their playbook. Less than 3 hours later, the quiet peace of my grandmother's house was violently interrupted by furious pounding on the front door. I set down my pen, walked down the hallway, and pulled the heavy door open. DeAndre stood on the porch, his face flushed red with exertion, holding a thick manila envelope. Lauren stood right beside him, her arms crossed tight across her chest, wearing an obnoxiously triumphant smirk. My parents hovered a few steps behind them, flanked by a very uncomfortable-looking local county sheriff deputy who kept checking his watch. "You really thought you won today, did you not?" DeAndre spat aggressively, stepping over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. "You thought pulling a massive federal raid would make us run and hide in the shadows. But you forgot one crucial, undeniable detail, Kierra. You do not own this property. You do not own anything." Lauren practically shoved DeAndre aside to get directly in my face. She yanked a crisp, newly printed legal document out of the envelope and slapped it forcefully against my chest. I caught the paper before it hit the hardwood floor, maintaining my steady gaze. "You need to pack your cheap suits and get off my property immediately," Lauren sneered, dripping with the kind of weaponized white privilege she always used to get her way in this family. "Did you honestly think Hattie would leave her legacy to a high school dropout who got knocked up in an alley? She knew you were a complete failure from the start. She loved me more than her own blood. Get out!" I did not react to her blatant insults. I slowly unfolded the heavy parchment document. It was a last will and testament, completely bypassing the original one I had filed with the state. My father stepped onto the porch, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at me. We found her real final will hidden in a safe deposit box this afternoon. Hattie realized you were nothing but a dark stain on this family name. She signed this new directive exactly 2 days before she died, revoking your inheritance entirely and leaving the house and all $780,000 directly to Lauren. It is perfectly legal and fully notarized by a state official. My mother pushed her way to the front of the group, her tear-stained face now twisted into a mask of cruel, arrogant vindication. The game is absolutely over, Kierra. We filed for an emergency summary judgment at the county courthouse this very morning. The local judge signed off on a preliminary eviction notice. You have exactly 1 hour to remove your trash from this property before the deputy here physically throws you out into the street. It is perfectly fitting. You are ending up exactly where I put you 20 years ago, in the cold gutter where you belong. The local deputy shifted his weight, clearing his throat nervously as he looked between us. Ma'am, I am just here to execute the preliminary order from the judge. If this document is legally valid, you do have to vacate the premises pending the formal probate hearing tomorrow morning. I do not want any trouble today. DeAndre crossed his muscular arms, looking around the vintage foyer like he was already measuring the walls for demolition. I told the construction crew to bring the bulldozers back tomorrow at dawn. I am going to truly enjoy watching this old, pathetic shack get ripped to pieces. Now get your bastard son and get off my wife's property before I have you arrested for trespassing. I looked down at the document in my hands. I read the standard legal boilerplate, the specific allocation of funds, the transfer of the deed directly to Lauren's name. I looked at the bottom of the page, examining the shaky signature that vaguely resembled my grandmother's elegant handwriting. Then I looked at the notary stamp pressed firmly into the bottom right corner of the paper, a bright blue ink seal validating the entire fraudulent transaction. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. I shook my head, tracing my thumb over the blue notary stamp. The absolute audacity of their desperation was staggering. They had panicked after the church raid and scrambled to forge a legal document in a matter of hours, paying zero attention to the details that actually mattered in a court of law. I looked up, meeting DeAndre's triumphant gaze. I held the document up to the light, tapping the blue ink seal with my index finger. Fascinating, I said, my voice cutting through the tense hallway. Grandma Hattie signed this in the presence of Notary Public Thomas Wright on October 14th. That is truly incredible, I replied, maintaining a deadly calm tone, considering I personally prosecuted Thomas Wright and he was sitting in federal prison on October 14th. The local deputy took one look at the fraudulent will and stepped backward. Presenting a forged document meant losing his badge. He instructed my family to vacate immediately, refusing their fake eviction notice. DeAndre looked hollowed out, his impending federal charges crushing his arrogant spirit. My father grabbed my mother's arm, dragging her toward their sedan. They drove away in disgrace, leaving the shattered porch railing behind. I spent the afternoon sweeping up splintered wood. As evening settled, heavy rain washed the dust from the driveway. Jamal headed back to his dorm, leaving me alone in Grandma Hattie's house. I was reviewing the asset forfeiture schedules when the doorbell chimed. I checked the security camera feed. Standing on my porch, soaking wet, was my father. Marcus Sr. always led with his chest demanding respect the second he walked into a room. But the man outside looked entirely different. His shoulders were slumped, his trench coat soaked, and he held a leather briefcase tightly against his side. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door wide open. "Kierra, please," my father said, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "Let me come inside. Just for a minute. I came here alone. I need to talk to my daughter." I stared at him for a long moment before stepping aside. He walked into the foyer, wiping his designer shoes on the welcome mat. He looked around the house, his eyes lingering on the vintage photographs lining the hallway. He let out a theatrical sigh, draping his wet coat over his arm. "You kept her house looking beautiful," he murmured, offering a sad, nostalgic smile. "You always had Hattie's spirit, strong, independent, unyielding. I saw it in you even as a little girl at the country club." I crossed my arms, leaning against the archway. Skip the nostalgia tour. You did not drive out here in the pouring rain to reminisce about my childhood. What do you want? My father dropped his head, performing a masterclass in paternal vulnerability. He walked over to the coffee table and set his heavy briefcase down. He snapped the brass locks open to reveal banded stacks of $100 bills. The sight of raw currency sitting in my grandmother's living room felt like a profound insult. "I am incredibly proud of you, Kierra," he said, his voice thick with fake tears. "Seeing those Harvard transcripts today, hearing you are a powerful federal prosecutor. You built an empire entirely on your own. You did not need my money, and you proved everyone wrong. I have never been more proud in my entire life." I kept my eyes locked on his face, waiting for the inevitable pivot. He stepped closer, holding his hands out in a pleading gesture. "I know we failed you. We made a mistake 20 years ago, Kierra. We were so obsessed with our reputation at the church that we lost sight of what actually mattered. Throwing you out into the snow when you were pregnant was the greatest failure of my life. I have carried that agonizing guilt every single day for 2 decades." He paused, letting the silence hang, expecting me to soften. When I remained still, he gestured to the open briefcase. "There is exactly $100,000 in untraceable cash sitting right there," he said softly. "Take it, Kierra. Take it for Jamal's future. Take it as an apology from a broken father who wants to make things right. All I ask in return is that you drop this probate fight. Let DeAndre have Grandma Hattie's house and the remaining estate funds. The federal agents have already seized his business accounts. If he does not get this inheritance, he is going to default on millions in fraudulent loans. He will go to federal prison for decades. Do not make another mistake by destroying your brother. Take the cash, let us save the family name, and we can start healing together." I looked at the stacks of money. To the 18-year-old girl freezing on the street 2 decades ago, that money would have been a miracle. To the 38-year-old federal prosecutor standing in front of him, it was a pathetic, desperate bribe. I looked back at my father, studying the fake tears welling in his eyes. The performance was spectacular. If I did not know better, I might have actually believed he loved me. I reached into my trousers and pulled out my secure government smartphone. "Healing together," I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "That is a beautiful sentiment. It almost makes me forget that you are currently under an active court-authorized federal wiretap due to your direct involvement in embezzling $2 million from innocent senior citizens." My father's fake smile instantly froze. The color drained from his face as he stared at the smartphone in my hand. I tapped the screen, opening the encrypted audio file my surveillance team forwarded to me exactly 2 hours ago. I turned the volume up and pressed play. My father's own voice filled the quiet living room, completely devoid of the weeping, apologetic warmth he had just displayed. The recorded audio was harsh and dripping with pure malice as he spoke to my mother on their telephone. "We will just give the bitch 100 grand. The recorded version of my father snarled, the audio echoing against the walls. "And once the heat dies down, we will bankrupt her. I will hire private investigators to ruin her career at the Justice Department. She is never taking what belongs to DeAndre." I paused the recording and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at the man who had helped bring me into this world, watching his facade shatter into pieces. His jaw trembled. "Grab your briefcase and get out of my house," I commanded, my voice slicing through the room like a steel blade. "And do not ever try to weaponize the word family against me again." I watched my father stumble out into the freezing rain, his heavy leather briefcase swinging at his side. He looked exactly like the pathetic, broken man he truly was, completely stripped of all his arrogant country club pride. I locked the deadbolt and went to sleep, knowing the real storm was just beginning. Across town, the very next morning, Lauren was eagerly busy brewing her own special highly toxic brand of poison inside her massive kitchen. My sister-in-law simply could not fathom a reality where a black teenage mother from the neighborhood had grown up to significantly outrank her. To Lauren, my official Department of Justice badge simply had to be a cheap, laughable novelty prop bought in a costume shop. My verified Harvard transcripts were obviously expensive. Counterfeits purchased online. In her extremely narrow mind, people like me did not wield actual federal power. We were just the help. Driven by her toxic arrogance, Lauren hired a discount private investigator she found on the internet. She foolishly paid him $500 to dig up my real employer, fully convinced I was merely working as a low-level paralegal or a receptionist at some struggling, completely unknown budget law firm. The incompetent investigator ran a basic background check and uncovered a direct office phone number associated with my federal employment records. He immediately handed the 10-digit number over to Lauren, completely failing to recognize the highly restricted federal prefix. Lauren did not bother to verify the information. She immediately dialed the number, ready to unleash her ultimate weapon, her blinding white privilege. When the line went straight to a generic automated voicemail, Lauren smiled maliciously and began to speak. She left a scathing 5-minute audio recording dripping with racial microaggressions and blatant entitlement. She aggressively demanded that my supervisor terminate my employment immediately and without any severance pay. She claimed I was an unhinged, dangerous woman from a broken background who was actively harassing a prominent, wealthy white family. She threatened to sue the entire department for severe emotional distress, casually mentioning her country club connections and demanding that the street trash be handled before she called the local police to file harassment charges. She ended the call feeling completely victorious, falsely believing she had just destroyed my entire livelihood with a single phone call. Later that afternoon, Lauren pranced into the formal dining room of her custom-built mansion, holding a glass of imported champagne. DeAndre was pacing the floor aggressively, chewing his thumbnail as he worried about his frozen bank accounts and his crumbling real estate empire. My mother Yvonne sat on the velvet sofa clutching a porcelain cup of tea, still reeling from the catastrophic disaster at the church. My father, Marcus Sr., stood silently in the far corner. He had not told any of them about his late-night visit to my house, nor had he mentioned the federal wiretap I had played for him. He was too cowardly to admit that they were already completely trapped in a federal net. Lauren confidently tapped her manicured nails against her crystal glass, demanding everyone's undivided attention. She let out a bright, artificial laugh that echoed through the tense room. "You all need to stop stressing over Kierra," Lauren announced, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "I handled the trash this morning. It is completely taken care of." DeAndre stopped pacing and looked at his wife with desperate, wide-eyed hope. "What did you do?" Lauren took a triumphant sip of her expensive champagne. "I hired a private investigator to find her actual boss. She is obviously faking that federal prosecutor nonsense to scare us into dropping the probate case. I called her supervisor directly and left a very clear, very firm voicemail. I told them she was exhibiting threatening ghetto behavior toward a prominent white family. I promised them a massive lawsuit. If they did not fire her immediately, corporate human resources departments are terrified of bad public relations. She will be packing up her little cubicle by the end of the day. Without a job, she will not have the funds to keep paying that fake lawyer of hers. The estate will default right back to us, and we can finally demolish that ugly heritage house tomorrow morning, without any further disruptions." My mother let out a heavy sigh of profound relief, pressing her hand against her chest. "Oh, Lauren, thank God for you. You always know exactly how to handle these unruly situations. We just needed to remind her of her actual place in the world." My father, however, did not speak a single word. He stared at Lauren in absolute unadulterated horror, his face turning a sickly ashen shade of gray. He knew the badge was real. He knew the wiretap was real. He knew exactly what his arrogant daughter-in-law had just done. Before my father could formulate a sentence to warn them, Lauren's custom ringtone echoed sharply through the dining room. She smiled smugly, setting her champagne glass down on the marble table. That is probably her boss calling to apologize to me right now, Lauren bragged, picking up the smartphone and pressing the speaker button so everyone could hear her glorious victory. Hello, this is Lauren Vance. A deep, stern, incredibly professional voice resonated from the phone speaker, immediately commanding absolute authority in the quiet room. Am I speaking with Lauren Vance, the registered owner of Vance Commercial Holdings and its associated subsidiaries? Lauren puffed out her chest, glancing triumphantly at DeAndre, firmly believing her intimidation tactics had worked flawlessly. Yes, you are. How can I help you today? The voice on the other end did not soften. Ma'am, this is the office of the United States Attorney General in Washington District of Columbia. We are calling to formally inquire why you are leaving racially charged, threatening voicemails on a highly secure, classified federal line directed at the head of the Financial Crimes Division. The line went dead. Lauren stood completely frozen in the center of the formal dining room, the color entirely drained from her arrogant face. The custom smartphone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the imported marble floor. She looked at DeAndre with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. She had just threatened a high-ranking federal official on a recorded government line, but my mother Yvonne, completely disconnected from the severe reality of federal law and blinded by her own ego, simply waved her hand and rolled her eyes. She picked up her porcelain teacup, completely dismissing the obvious panic radiating from her daughter-in-law. Yvonne insisted that it was just a scare tactic, a desperate final bluff from a woman who knew she was about to lose everything in probate court tomorrow morning. My father, Marcus Sr., remained dead silent in the corner, staring at the floor. He knew the truth about my federal badge and the wiretaps, but his cowardice kept him paralyzed. He allowed his wife to continue driving their family straight off a cliff because protecting his ego was more important than admitting he was wrong. They were seated inside the most exclusive private dining room at the Oak Ridge Country Club. Yvonne wanted an audience there. DeAndre sat to her right, swirling expensive bourbon. He was sweating his leg, bouncing nervously under the table. Lauren sat next to him, picking at her salad, jumping every time a waiter walked past their chairs. The voicemail she left earlier that day was playing on a continuous haunting loop inside her head. Despite the palpable anxiety radiating from her son and daughter-in-law, Yvonne stood up and tapped her silver spoon against her champagne flute. The room quieted down as the elite guests turned their attention to the matriarch. Yvonne offered a toast to the enduring strength of their bloodline. She spoke eloquently about how DeAndre was going to use Hattie's estate to build a magnificent community center, continuing the tradition of Black excellence and philanthropy. She assured her wealthy friends that tomorrow's probate hearing was a mere formality, a simple signature from a friendly local judge that would permanently evict the dark stain from their family history. Everyone raised their glasses, applauding Yvonne's impeccable grace under pressure. Marcus Sr. raised his glass too, though his hands shook so violently that the champagne spilled over the rim. Right on cue, the oak doors of the private dining room opened. A line of 6 waiters dressed in immaculate black tuxedos and white cotton gloves marched into the room in perfect unison. They carried large silver trays, each covered by a polished silver cloche. Yvonne smiled brightly, gesturing for her guests to take their seats. She announced she had pre-ordered the most expensive cuts of dry-aged steak the country club kitchen could provide. She wanted the meal to reflect their victory. The waiters stepped up to the table, positioning themselves directly behind Yvonne, Marcus Sr., DeAndre, and Lauren. The head waiter, a tall, imposing man who did not match the usual country club staff profile, gave a sharp nod. In perfect synchronization, the waiters grabbed the brass handles and lifted the heavy silver cloches off the porcelain plates. There was no dry-aged steak underneath. There were no gourmet side dishes. There was only thick, heavy stacks of federal legal documents bound by thick red tape and stamped with the unmistakable, terrifying seal of the United States Department of Justice. The dining room descended into a sudden, suffocating silence. The jazz music outside seemed to fade away completely. Yvonne stared down at her plate, her perfect smile freezing into a mask of pure confusion. She blinked rapidly, unable to comprehend why a stack of paperwork was sitting on her fine china. DeAndre dropped his bourbon glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending amber liquid pooling around his expensive leather shoes. Lauren let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing both of her hands over her mouth, as the reality of the morning phone call finally materialized in front of her. "What is the meaning of this?" Yvonne demanded, her voice shrill and indignant as she glared at the head waiter. "I ordered the filet mignon. Bring the country club manager here immediately. This is an outrageous and unacceptable mistake." The head waiter calmly reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a golden federal badge, letting it hang from his chest pocket. He looked directly at my brother. DeAndre Vance, Yvonne Vance, Marcus Vance Sr., and Lauren Vance. You have all been officially served with federal subpoenas. You are ordered to appear in United States District Court to answer to a 32-count federal indictment. DeAndre scrambled out of his chair, knocking it backward into the wall. His chest heaved as he frantically grabbed the thick stack of documents from his plate. He tore through the thick red tape, his eyes frantically darting across the pages. He read the devastating list of criminal charges printed in bold black ink: federal wire fraud, money laundering, extortion, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, racketeering, embezzlement of church funds, witness tampering. He flipped through the pages with reckless desperation, his hands shaking violently. He needed to know who was authorizing this massive, inescapable attack. He needed to know which ruthless federal entity had quietly built a bulletproof case against his entire fake real estate empire while he was busy bragging about his country club status. DeAndre aggressively flipped the final page of the subpoena over to see the official authorization signature at the bottom of the indictment. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, agonizing wheeze. He stared at the bold, elegant handwriting, inked across the signature line, the truth completely destroying the arrogant reality he had lived in for the last 20 years. The authorizing prosecutor's signature read, Kierra Vance, Department of Justice. Silence in the dining room was broken only by DeAndre gasping for air. He dropped the federal subpoena onto the white tablecloth like it was burning his fingers. Yvonne snatched the thick stack of papers, scanning the bottom of the page. She stared at my signature, but instead of terrifying realization, a look of profound, stubborn denial washed over her face. She violently slammed her hand down on the table, knocking over a crystal water glass. "This is a fake!" Yvonne hissed, her voice vibrating with desperate arrogance. "She is a dropout. She is a teenage mother who lived in the projects. She probably works as a low-level secretary filing paperwork in some government basement and stole some official stationery to print this garbage. She is trying to scare us into dropping the probate case. I refuse to be intimidated by a delinquent child playing dress-up." Marcus Sr. tried to speak, tried to warn her about the wiretap and the badge, but his cowardice kept his mouth firmly shut. Yvonne did not wait for a response. She grabbed her designer purse, her mind already racing to construct a new twisted narrative. Yvonne decided she would absolutely destroy my reputation in the court of public opinion. By 8 in the morning the next day, Yvonne was sitting inside the broadcasting booth of the most listened-to morning radio show in the city. The program was hosted by a smooth-talking man named Reverend Thomas. He catered to the elite African-American demographic, making him the perfect mouthpiece for her tears. Yvonne leaned into the studio microphone, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She was wearing her most conservative, elegant church suit, projecting the absolute image of a heartbroken, victimized matriarch. "It is just so devastating, Reverend Thomas." My mother sniffled, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. My mother, Hattie, was a pillar of this community. When she passed, we were mourning deeply. But then my estranged daughter, Kierra, returned out of nowhere. She ran away 20 years ago, choosing a life of rebellion and sin. We tried to save her, we truly did. But now she has manipulated a sick, elderly woman into signing over her entire estate. Kierra is a dark stain on this family, and she is holding the family legacy hostage out of pure greed. Reverend Thomas leaned forward, completely captivated by the drama. His producer signaled from the control room that the phone lines were lighting up. The audience was eating out of the palm of her hand. "That is a tragedy," Sister Yvonne, the host, said. his voice dripping with radio-perfected sympathy. To see a prodigal child return not for redemption but for theft. I understand she is targeting your son DeAndre Vance, a man who has done so much to build up our local real estate. Yes, Yvonne cried, clutching her pearls for emphasis. DeAndre is a saint. He wanted to use all the money to build a youth empowerment center. But Kierra is harassing him. She is sending fake government documents and threatening to ruin his pristine business. She is a dangerous, unhinged woman, and I am sitting here today begging the community to pray for us. We just want to protect her legacy from a very greedy delinquent who refuses to work. The smear campaign was perfection. Listeners were calling and expressing outrage at the greedy daughter terrorizing a prominent family. Yvonne smiled behind her tissue. She felt powerful again. She believed she successfully painted me as the villain, confident that public pressure would force me to surrender the money and the house. She thought she had won the war. Reverend Thomas adjusted his headphones, ready to deliver a passionate sermon about respecting your elders and the dangers of greed. Sister Yvonne, your strength is an inspiration to us all. We will rally the congregation to support DeAndre and ensure this rogue daughter is held accountable. It is a shame when the very people you raise turn around and bite the hand that fed them. The host stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes darted toward the soundproof glass of the control room. His producer was frantically waving both arms, pointing at the television monitors on the studio wall. Reverend Thomas pressed his hand against his right earpiece, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The radio broadcast experienced 10 seconds of dead, awkward silence. Yvonne lowered her handkerchief, looking mildly annoyed by the sudden interruption to her flawless performance. "Is something wrong, Reverend?" she asked. Reverend Thomas held his hand up, signaling her to remain quiet. His face drained of color as he listened to his news director screaming through his earpiece. He looked at my mother, the sympathy in his eyes replaced by absolute shock. He leaned slowly into his microphone, his professional broadcasting voice trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Thomas announced, the gravity of the situation echoing across the airwaves. "We interrupt this broadcast for a major breaking news alert coming in live from the downtown financial district. Federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Internal Revenue Service are currently executing a massive raid. They are seizing assets, computers, and files from the corporate headquarters of Vance Real Estate." Yvonne froze completely rigid in her leather chair. The blood stopped moving through her veins. Reverend Thomas kept his eyes locked on my mother as he read the breaking news directly to his listeners. Authorities confirm developer DeAndre Vance is the primary target of a federal indictment involving a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme and the embezzlement of church funds. Yvonne could not breathe. The walls of the soundproof broadcasting booth rapidly closed in on her. The arrogant reality she built her life upon shattered right there on live radio. Her eyes rolled back into her head. Her body went entirely limp, and she collapsed violently to the studio floor, fainting dead away as the sirens of federal justice echoed across the city. DeAndre stared at the television in his master bedroom. He watched the local morning news showing federal agents carrying cardboard boxes out of his corporate headquarters. The news ticker flashed the details of his multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. He heard Reverend Thomas narrating the raid, moments before his mother collapsed. DeAndre dropped his phone. The arrogant facade he maintained for 20 years evaporated, leaving only the raw, suffocating terror of a man realizing he was about to spend his life inside a federal penitentiary. He sprinted to his desk and ripped open his laptop. His hands shook violently as he logged into his offshore banking portal. He needed to move the remaining $3 million of stolen church retirement funds into a Cayman Islands account before the federal freeze registered in the international banking system. He furiously typed routing numbers, sweat pouring down his forehead, staining his shirt. Lauren burst through the doors, her eyes wild with panic, holding her ringing smartphone. Her wealthy country club friends were already calling, demanding to know why her name was associated with dummy corporations and federal wire fraud. She slammed her hands down on the polished wood. What exactly is happening, DeAndre? Lauren screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. My father just called me from the golf course. He said the FBI is raiding your office, and my name is listed on the federal warrants as the managing director of your shell companies. You told me those signatures were just a standard tax loophole. You told me putting the properties in my name was just to protect our assets from your greedy family. DeAndre did not look up from the computer screen. He kept typing, his breathing shallow and rapid. Pack a bag, Lauren. Do not pack anything heavy. We are taking the private charter to the Caribbean. I am wiring the cash right now. We have to leave before the feds show up at the front gate. Lauren stared at him, her face twisting into a mask of pure rage. She realized in that exact moment that her husband was not a brilliant real estate tycoon. He was a common thief, and he had used her pristine white pedigree to legitimize his massive criminal enterprise. I am not packing anything, Lauren yelled, grabbing his shoulder and forcibly spinning his chair around. I am not running away like a common criminal. I am a member of the most prominent family in this city. I do not run from the police. You are going to call your lawyers right now, and you will tell them that you forged my signature. You are going to take the fall for this. DeAndre, you will sign a full confession stating that you manipulated me. DeAndre jumped up, his own fury finally boiling over. He pointed a shaking finger in her face. You signed every single one of those documents willingly, Lauren. You happily spent the millions we stole from my parents' church. You bought your designer bags and imported cars with that stolen money. Do not try to play the innocent victim now. We are both on those federal indictments. If I go down, you are going into the cell next to me. I will never step foot inside a prison, Lauren shrieked, her voice echoing through the house. I will call my father. He knows federal judges. He knows senators. He will make sure they look at a wealthy white woman from a respectable family and see a victim. They will look at you and see exactly what your sister always was. A reckless criminal who could not escape his nature. You fix it. DeAndre ignored her racist vitriol. He grabbed his leather duffel bag, stuffed his laptop inside, and sprinted down the staircase, leaving her screaming. Lauren realized he was actually leaving her behind to face the federal agents alone. Panic overrode her arrogance. She grabbed her purse and ran after him, following him out to the driveway. They sped toward the private executive airport in complete silence, the tension inside the vehicle thick enough to choke on. They pulled onto the private tarmac, the tires screeching to a halt next to a sleek twin-engine charter jet. The pilot was standing near the boarding stairs, holding a digital tablet. DeAndre grabbed his duffel bag and rushed toward the aircraft, waving his arms frantically. Start the engines, DeAndre ordered, tossing his bag on the tarmac. We need to be in the air 5 minutes ago. I wired the payment for the flight directly to your corporate account. The pilot did not move toward the stairs. He looked down at his tablet and shook his head, stepping squarely in front of the aircraft door. I am sorry, sir, but I cannot let you board this plane. Your wire transfer did not clear. In fact, the bank just notified our billing department that your routing number has been permanently frozen by the United States government. The transaction was declined. Your account balance reads exactly $0.00. DeAndre froze, the color draining from his face. Lauren gasped, clutching her designer purse against her chest as she stared at the pilot in utter disbelief. She frantically pulled out her phone, opening her banking app to check her personal accounts. Every single account displayed a stark, terrifying zero balance. The millions of dollars were entirely gone. A sleek black government SUV quietly pulled onto the tarmac, pulling up directly behind DeAndre's vehicle. The heavy car doors opened simultaneously. I stepped out onto the concrete tarmac, adjusting the lapels of my tailored navy suit. I was flanked by 2 heavily armed United States Marshals wearing tactical vests. I walked slowly toward the aircraft, the sound of my heels echoing across the open runway. Going somewhere, DeAndre? I asked, maintaining a perfectly calm, lethal tone, as I slowly looked down at his duffel bag sitting alone on the cold concrete ground. You completely forgot to pack your heavy luggage. The U.S. Marshals stepped forward on the rain-slicked tarmac and confiscated DeAndre's leather duffel bag. I did not arrest him right there. That would have been entirely too merciful. I simply had the federal agents confiscate his and Lauren's passports, stripping away their final desperate avenue of escape. I looked at my brother as he stood shivering in the cold wind. I strongly suggest you attend the probate hearing tomorrow morning, DeAndre, I said, turning my back on him. You are going to need every single penny of Grandma Hattie's estate to pay for your upcoming federal defense attorneys. I walked back to my vehicle, leaving Lauren screaming at her husband on the empty airstrip. The next morning, the heavy doors of the county probate courthouse swung open. The air inside felt thick with a suffocating energy. My family sat huddled together on the wooden benches in the gallery, looking like mere shadows of their former selves. DeAndre wore the same wrinkled suit from yesterday, his eyes darting frantically. Lauren sat as far away from him as physically possible, clutching her handbag. My mother Yvonne sat rigidly in the second row wearing a black church dress. Her carefully constructed facade was actively deteriorating. She stared blankly at the back of my head, rocking slightly. "Stain on the family," she muttered under her breath. The words were a low, rhythmic chant vibrating through the quiet courtroom. "Stain on the family." She repeated the phrase over and over, clinging to that toxic, familiar narrative because it was the absolute last shred of dignity she had left. She kept her eyes unfocused, whispering her venomous mantra to nobody in particular. Gary stood at the plaintiff's table, nervously shuffling his stack of legal documents. The aggressive probate lawyer was entirely gone. He was sweating profusely, moisture gathering on his forehead. He knew I carried a federal badge, but he was completely trapped. DeAndre owed Gary tens of thousands in legal fees, and securing Grandma Hattie's $780,000 estate was the only way Gary was getting paid. He had no choice but to push forward with his fraudulent case, hoping the judge was unaware of the federal investigation. The bailiff announced Judge Harrison a stern man with a reputation for running a strict courtroom. We all stood as he took his seat at the high mahogany bench, opening the thick case file. "Your Honor." Gary began, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat. "We are here today to resolve the estate of the late Hattie Vance. We are petitioning for an immediate summary judgment to invalidate the initial will presented by the respondent, Kierra Vance. We have evidence that the respondent, a high school dropout, deliberately manipulated a highly vulnerable elderly woman into signing over her primary residence and her entire life savings." Gary wiped his forehead with a crumpled tissue, pacing nervously. He kept his eyes glued to the bench, pushing his fabricated narrative. "We submit that the respondent used predatory tactics to secure this money," Gary argued, waving a hand toward my table. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have a secondary updated will signed by the deceased just 2 days prior to her passing, which explicitly leaves the entirety of the estate to her beloved daughter-in-law, Lauren Vance. We respectfully request that you validate this final document and immediately evict Kierra Vance from the heritage property." From the gallery behind me, my mother's relentless whispering grew louder. "Stain on the family. A stain on this entire family." Jamal sat perfectly still in the chair next to me, wearing a sharp navy suit. "Are you going to object to any of this garbage?" he whispered softly. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table. "Never interrupt your enemy when he is busy digging his own grave," I whispered back. "Let Gary put all his lies on the official court record. It makes the perjury charges easier to file later today." Gary finished his sweaty, desperate monologue and heavily leaned against his table, breathing hard. He looked up at the judge, expecting the usual local country club courtesy. He thought throwing around the Vance family name would be enough to secure a swift, favorable ruling. Judge Harrison did not look up right away. He slowly turned the pages of the thick case file, running his finger down a specific document. He adjusted his glasses, peering over the rims at the sweating attorney. He let the heavy silence drag out, forcing Gary to shift uncomfortably. "Mr. Gary," Judge Harrison finally said, his voice echoing sharply, "I have reviewed your petition regarding the Hattie Vance estate. However, I cannot rule on this estate today, tomorrow, or any time in the foreseeable future." Gary blinked, his mouth falling open in shock. But, Your Honor, the documentation is right there. The family urgently needs these funds released to maintain their commercial properties. Judge Harrison pulled a document from the folder and held it up. The paper bore a bright red federal seal. I cannot rule on this estate, Mr. Gary, because I no longer have legal jurisdiction over any asset associated with your clients. This morning, my clerk received an emergency federal injunction. There is an active comprehensive asset freeze on all Vance family holdings under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This RICO freeze covers real estate bank accounts and any pending probate inheritances tied to DeAndre or Lauren Vance. The judge dropped this paper back onto his desk, looking directly at my brother, who was sinking lower into his wooden bench. This federal injunction strips this county court of all authority regarding these funds, Judge Harrison concluded, matching my calm, steady gaze across the room. The freeze order is absolute and it is signed directly by the Department of Justice. Gary stood completely frozen, realizing his entire legal career had just been entirely destroyed in an instant. He looked at my mother, who was still whispering those exact words. Gary swallowed, wiping sweat from his chin, overriding his shock. He needed to invalidate my will. Proving Grandma Hattie incompetent meant the federal asset freeze on DeAndre's inheritance became a jurisdictional nightmare, possibly buying time to negotiate a plea. Your Honor, Gary stammered, gripping his table. The federal freeze applies to asset distribution, but this court retains jurisdiction over testamentary validity. The will is void. Hattie Vance lacked testamentary capacity. I call our medical witness. Judge Harrison frowned, gesturing for the bailiff to open the doors. A man marched into the courtroom wearing a pinstripe suit that looked too expensive for a local physician. He carried a sleek portfolio, walking with practiced clinical arrogance. He took the oath and settled into the witness box, adjusting his silver tie. Please state your name for the record, Gary instructed, his confidence slightly returning. Dr. Richard Evans, the man replied, projecting an authoritative baritone. I was the concierge physician for Hattie Vance during her final 2 years. Gary paced in front of the witness box. Dr. Evans, in your expert medical opinion, what was the cognitive state of Hattie Vance when she allegedly signed over her entire estate to the respondent? Dr. Evans opened his portfolio, withdrawing heavily redacted charts. Mrs. Vance suffered from advanced vascular dementia, exhibiting severe cognitive decline, acute paranoia, and frequent visual hallucinations. In my professional assessment, she was legally insane and entirely incapable of understanding the consequences of signing any binding contract during her final 6 months. She lacked all mental capacity. A smug, satisfied grin spread across DeAndre's face. My mother, Yvonne, momentarily stopped her muttering, sitting up straighter in the gallery. They thought they had found the perfect loophole. If Grandma Hattie was legally insane, my inheritance would be voided outright, leaving the estate in a chaotic limbo that DeAndre could exploit. Thank you, Dr. Gary said, turning to the bench with a triumphant smirk. Your witness. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back against the polished hardwood floor. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy suit, picking up a single manila folder. Judge Harrison looked at me with mild curiosity. Miss Vance, do you have legal counsel present for cross-examination? I stepped out from behind the defense table. I will be representing myself, Your Honor. Lauren let out a sharp, mocking laugh from the gallery. DeAndre leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. They truly believed my federal prosecutor badge was just an administrative title. They thought I was a paper pusher unequipped for the brutal tactical warfare of a live courtroom cross-examination. I walked to the center of the room, stopping directly in front of the witness box. I did not look at my notes. I stared directly into the doctor's eyes, letting the silence stretch until he nervously shifted his weight in the wooden chair. Dr. Evans, you just testified under oath that my grandmother suffered from advanced vascular dementia. During her final 6 months, I began, my voice ringing with calm, lethal precision. You stated she was experiencing acute paranoia and severe cognitive decline. Is that correct? Yes, that is my clinical diagnosis, the doctor replied, lifting his chin defensively. I opened my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. According to your own submitted medical charts, you prescribed her Aricept and Seroquel to manage these aggressive symptoms. You noted she required a continuous high dosage to remain docile. You personally signed off on these prescriptions every week. That is standard protocol for advanced dementia patients, he answered smoothly, glancing at Gary for validation. I paced slowly toward the jury box. That is fascinating medical protocol, doctor. Because I hold the certified autopsy and toxicology report from the county medical examiner. I read directly from the highlighted text. The toxicology screen shows absolutely zero trace of Aricept Seroquel or any other cognitive-altering medication in Hattie Vance's bloodstream. In fact, her neurological autopsy revealed a perfectly healthy brain for a woman her age with absolutely zero plaque buildup associated with vascular dementia. Dr. Evans froze. His practiced clinical arrogance instantly evaporated. He gripped the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles turning white. Medical metabolism varies, he stammered quickly. The drugs might have cleared her system. I did not let him breathe. I took another step forward, raising my voice. They cleared her system because she never took them. She never took them because she did not have dementia. You falsified her entire medical history to create a convenient paper trail for my brother. You diagnosed a perfectly healthy woman as legally insane so DeAndre could bypass her will and steal her entire estate. Objection! Gary shouted, jumping out of his chair. This is baseless harassment of an expert witness. Overruled, Judge Harrison snapped, leaning forward over the bench, his eyes locked on the sweating doctor. Continue, Miss Vance. I turned back to the witness stand. Dr. Evans, let us talk about your lucrative concierge medical practice. You charge a premium for your exclusive services, yet you treated my own grandmother entirely pro bono. Why is that? I perform charity work for the elderly community? He lied, his voice dropping an octave. I walked over to the audiovisual cart stationed near the clerk's desk. I picked up the remote control and powered on the digital projector. A massive high-resolution image flashed onto the screen behind the bench. The entire courtroom gasped. The photograph was crystal clear, captured by an undercover federal surveillance team. It showed Dr. Evans standing in a dark, underground parking garage. Standing directly across from him was my brother, DeAndre Vance. DeAndre was in the middle of handing the doctor a sleek metal briefcase bursting with cash. I turned to face the witness box, my voice echoing like thunder across the shocked courtroom. Dr. Evans, isn't it true your medical license was revoked in 3 states for taking bribes? The photograph projected on the courtroom wall showed Dr. Evans accepting a briefcase full of cash directly from DeAndre. The image was perfectly clear. Color drained from the corrupt doctor's face as he stared at his own reflection. Heavy silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Dr. Evans opened his mouth to respond, but his vocal cords completely failed him. I took one step closer to the witness box, keeping my posture straight and my voice calm. I asked you a very direct question, Dr. Evans, I stated, ensuring the reporter captured every syllable. Is it true your medical license was revoked in 3 states for accepting bribes? Gary jumped out of his chair so fast it screeched against the floor. Objection, Your Honor! Gary shouted frantically, waving his hands. This line of questioning is highly prejudicial and completely irrelevant to the probate matter at hand. We are here to discuss Hattie Vance, not my medical witness. Judge Harrison slammed his heavy gavel down onto his desk with a deafening crack. The noise made Yvonne jump out of her seat. Overruled. Mr. Gary the judge barked, his eyes narrowed in fury. If your medical witness has a history of accepting bribes to forge documents, it is relevant to this court. Dr. Evans, you are under oath. Answer the question immediately. The disgraced physician gripped the witness stand until his knuckles turned white. He looked frantically at Gary, then shifted his terrified gaze toward DeAndre, who was shaking his head from side to side. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Dr. Evans whispered, his voice trembling with panic. He refused to look at me or the judge. I refused to answer. I offered a cold smile and turned my back on him. No further questions, Your Honor, I announced, walking back to my seat next to Jamal. Judge Harrison looked thoroughly disgusted by the pathetic display. He waved his hand, dismissing the ruined physician from the stand. All medical testimony regarding Hattie Vance, provided by this witness, is stricken from the record, the judge declared, his voice booming with authority. Mr. Gary, your deliberate attempt to invalidate the original will using a bribed witness borders on severe professional misconduct. I am denying your motion for summary judgment. Furthermore, I am forwarding the entire transcript of today's hearing to the State Bar Association for disciplinary review. Gary collapsed heavily into his chair, burying his sweating face in his hands. His lucrative legal career was effectively terminated. Yvonne sat rigidly in the gallery, her hands shaking violently as she clutched her expensive handbag. She stared at the back of my head, paralyzed by her own toxic delusions. A dark stain on the family, she whispered over and over, rocking slightly in the wooden pew. She was clinging to her favorite venomous phrase because facing reality meant admitting she supported a criminal son while throwing away a successful daughter. DeAndre was sweating profusely, his suit suddenly looking sloppy and disheveled. He fully realized the probate case was completely dead. He knew he was never getting Grandma Hattie's $780,000 to bail out his fraudulent real estate empire. But my brother always kept one last desperate trick tucked up his sleeve. He had quietly liquidated a hidden offshore bank account just hours before the federal freeze to hire the most ruthless, expensive defense attorney in the state. The heavy oak door at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open. A tall, impeccably dressed man strode confidently down the center aisle. He wore a flawless charcoal suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase that commanded immediate respect. This was Jonathan Sterling, an elite defense attorney legendary for getting corrupt politicians and wealthy executives out of federal indictments. DeAndre let out a loud, dramatic sigh of profound relief. He sat up straight, aggressively adjusting his silk tie and shooting me a look of pure venom. He leaned across the center aisle, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are completely dead now, Kierra," DeAndre sneered, his voice dripping with arrogant confidence. "You thought you could permanently trap me with your little government badge and your cute slideshow presentations. I just spent my last hidden dime hiring the absolute best legal mind in this city. He has destroyed cases 10 times bigger than yours. You are completely out of your depth. Sterling destroys amateur lawyers, and he is going to rip your fake investigation to shreds." Lauren suddenly leaned forward, a cruel smirk replacing her previous terror. She absolutely loved the idea of a powerful white attorney stepping in to put me back in my place. "Finally, some real legal representation," Lauren scoffed loudly, crossing her arms. "It is about time someone reminded you how things actually work in the real world, Kierra. You are going to be paying our legal fees for the rest of your life." I did not react to their taunts. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited patiently. Jonathan Sterling marched past the wooden divider separating the gallery from the court floor. DeAndre stood up quickly, extending his hand with a massive, relieved grin, expecting his savior to greet him and begin damage control. Sterling completely ignored DeAndre. He ignored my brother's outstretched hand, walking straight past the defense table, leaving DeAndre standing awkwardly in the middle of the room. Sterling strode directly across the courtroom, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor. He stopped directly in front of my prosecution table. The entire room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Sterling casually set his heavy briefcase down on the floor. He reached up and carefully buttoned his suit jacket in a gesture of profound professional respect. He looked me directly in the eye and offered a deep, formal bow of his head. "Good morning, Prosecutor Sterling," said his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "I have the surrender paperwork ready." DeAndre stops breathing completely as his entire arrogant fake world collapses forever. The heavy silence in the probate courtroom was absolute. DeAndre collapsed backward into his wooden chair. His knees completely gave out beneath the weight of his imported suit. He stared at Jonathan Sterling. The elite attorney he had paid a small fortune to save his life was not standing beside him. Sterling was standing in front of me, his hands clasped respectfully over his briefcase, waiting for my instruction. DeAndre gasped for air, his hands clutching the edge of the defense table. His brain violently rejected the reality playing out in front of him. He looked from Sterling to me, his eyes wide with terror. "You cannot represent her." DeAndre stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic high-pitched wheeze. "I paid your retainer. I hired you to destroy this fake prosecutor." Sterling slowly turned his head to look at my brother. The expression on the famous attorney's face was completely devoid of sympathy. He looked at DeAndre the exact same way a person looks at a cockroach trapped in a glass jar. "You attempted to hire me using stolen church funds," Mr. Vance Sterling replied, his deep voice echoing sharply off the courtroom walls. "As an officer of the court, I am legally obligated to report anyone attempting to retain my services with illicit capital. When I flagged your tainted wire transfer, the Department of Justice informed me Prosecutor Kierra Vance was already running a comprehensive RICO investigation into your entire criminal enterprise. My presence here today was explicitly coordinated with federal authorities to ensure your peaceful surrender." I nodded to the attorney. "Thank you for your cooperation with the Department of Justice, Mr. Sterling. You may hand over the surrender paperwork to the marshals." The reality of my true power finally shattered the Vance family delusions. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. Two federal agents stepped inside, their tactical vests displaying bright yellow FBI letters. They walked decisively down the center aisle, holding heavy metal handcuffs. Lauren leaped out of her seat. The arrogant sneer she had worn just moments ago morphed into a frantic, ugly mask of sheer panic. She instinctively backed away from her husband, physically distancing herself from the sinking ship. She threw her hands up, stepping directly into the path of the approaching federal agents. "Do not take another step toward me!" Lauren shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the gallery. She thrust her chin out immediately, attempting to weaponize the deep-seated white privilege she had used to terrorize people her entire life. "You have no right to approach me. Do you have any idea who my father is? He plays golf with the governor. My family built this city. I will have your badges stripped by tomorrow morning. I am a prominent, respectable woman, and I will not be treated like some common street thug." The federal agents did not even slow their pace. They marched right past her frantic threats. Lauren spun around, pointing a shaking finger at Jonathan Sterling. "You are a disgrace to your profession," Lauren screamed, completely losing her mind. "You took our money. You are supposed to defend us against this ghetto trash. I am calling the State Bar Association right now. I will have you permanently disbarred for setting us up. You are going to pay for this betrayal." Sterling did not flinch. He adjusted his pristine cuffs and looked at Lauren with icy detachment. "You cannot disbar a federal informant, Mrs. Vance, and I strongly suggest you remain silent. Everything you say right now is being recorded by the court reporter." The FBI agents reached the defense table. DeAndre did not fight back. He lacked the spine for an actual physical confrontation. He simply sat in his chair, openly weeping as the agent firmly grabbed his wrists, pulled them behind his back, and secured the heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the quiet courtroom. Lauren completely unraveled. When the second agent reached for her arm, she flailed wildly, smacking her handbag against the wooden table. "Get your hands off me," she sobbed hysterically. "I am a victim. My husband forced me to sign those corporation papers. I did not know he was stealing from a church. I am a wealthy, innocent woman. You are targeting me because of reverse racism." The female FBI agent expertly grabbed Lauren's flailing wrist, pinning it securely behind her back. "Lauren Vance, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit money laundering under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You have the right to remain silent." The sound of the Miranda rights being read finally broke my mother. Yvonne had been sitting completely paralyzed in the gallery. She watched her golden boy, the son she had praised and worshipped her entire life, being treated like a common criminal. She watched her untouchable daughter-in-law getting forcefully shackled. Yvonne scrambled out of the wooden pew. She stumbled toward the wooden divider, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She gripped the wooden railing, her knuckles turning white. Kierra, stop this right now! Yvonne wailed, her voice cracking with raw, desperate agony. You cannot do this to us. Tell them to take those handcuffs off your brother. Tell them to let DeAndre go. Please, Kierra, we are your family. You cannot put your own flesh and blood into a federal prison. I slowly stood up from the prosecution table. I slowly smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored navy suit jacket. I picked up my gold fountain pen and secured it inside my pocket. I walked over to the wooden divider and looked down at my weeping mother. Family, I asked, my voice deadly calm. I am just the stain on the family, remember? The careless mistake. And my greatest mistake was ever thinking you people had a soul. I turned my back on my mother and walked away, leaving the heavy oak doors of the probate courtroom open behind me. The sound of the FBI agents reading DeAndre and Lauren their federal Miranda rights echoed down the marble hallway. My parents were left standing alone in the center of the gallery, surrounded by the shattered remnants of their delusions. Their golden child was on his way to a federal holding cell, and the pristine reputation they had sacrificed their own daughter to protect was officially dead. The fallout was swift, absolute, and entirely merciless. In our community, social currency is everything, and bankruptcy combined with a federal indictment is the ultimate death sentence. Within 48 hours, the news of the church embezzlement scandal blanketed every local media outlet. The very people my parents had spent decades trying to impress were the first ones to tear them apart. My father, Marcus Sr., experienced the brutal destruction of his pride first. For 30 years, his identity had been completely tied to his elite historically black fraternity and his untouchable status at the Oak Ridge Country Club. 2 days after the courtroom disaster, he received a letter from his fraternity's national headquarters. The board had convened an emergency tribunal. Because of his direct involvement in auditing the stolen church retirement funds, he was formally stripped of his membership. He was ordered to return his pins, his plaques, and his ceremonial jackets. Desperate to salvage some shred of his dignity, he drove directly to the country club, hoping to rally support from his wealthy golfing partners. He did not even make it past the front gate. The general manager intercepted him in the driveway, handing him a cardboard box containing his golf shoes and his expensive cigars. His lifetime membership was permanently revoked. His so-called friends stood on the clubhouse veranda sipping their expensive bourbons, watching security escort him off the premises. Not a single man walked down the steps to defend him. My mother suffered a public, agonizing humiliation. Yvonne had always ruled the First Zion Fellowship with an iron fist, using her position as the head event coordinator to bully and intimidate anyone who did not meet her ridiculous standards. The Sunday following the federal raid, she attempted to walk into the sanctuary as if nothing had happened. She wore her most expensive designer hat, clutching her Bible, desperately trying to project an image of a persecuted, innocent matriarch. Pastor Williams stopped her right in the middle of the central aisle. The entire congregation fell silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Pastor Williams did not lower his voice. He announced that the church board had reviewed the financial ledgers. Because Yvonne had actively facilitated the theft of the elderly congregation members' life savings, she was officially stripped of all her titles. She was permanently excommunicated from the fellowship. The women who used to hang on her every word now turned their backs on her, refusing to even make eye contact. Yvonne was forced to turn around and do the humiliating walk of shame out of the sanctuary, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the silence of the very community she had helped defraud. Within a month, my parents were utterly destitute. The federal government seized their bank accounts, linking their funds directly to DeAndre's money laundering operations. The bank foreclosed on their mansion. They were forced to pack whatever clothes they could carry in garbage bags and move into a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was the exact same type of neighborhood they had thrown me into when I was an 18-year-old pregnant girl. They were drowning in massive legal fees, desperately trying to avoid their own criminal indictments for aiding and abetting. With nowhere else to turn, their arrogance finally mutated into groveling desperation. They tracked Jamal down. My son was walking out of the federal courthouse downtown after delivering a stack of legal briefs to my office. He was wearing a sharp-tailored gray suit, carrying his leather messenger bag, looking every bit the brilliant young man he was. Marcus Sr. and Yvonne stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, ambushing him near the courthouse steps. They looked completely disheveled, their once expensive clothes heavily wrinkled and hanging loosely on their thinning frames. My mother reached out with a trembling hand, grabbing the sleeve of Jamal's suit jacket. "Jamal, please." Yvonne begged, her voice cracking with raw panic. "Please, you have to talk to your mother. You have to make Kierra listen to reason. We are going to lose everything. The lawyers are demanding retainers we cannot possibly pay, and the prosecutors are threatening to indict us by Friday afternoon." My father removed his hat, his eyes watering. "We are your grandparents, Jamal. We share the same blood. We made terrible mistakes, but you cannot let your mother put us in a federal prison. You are a smart young man. You know how important family is. Tell Kierra we will do whatever she wants. Just beg her to drop the accessory charges against us." Jamal stopped walking. He did not flinch, and he did not pull his arm away. He stood perfectly still, looking at the two people who had gleefully demanded his abortion 20 years ago. He looked at the grandparents who had called him a delinquent, who had stood by while his Aunt Lauren tried to frame him for drug dealing to ruin his entire academic future. Jamal reached down and removed Yvonne's hand from his jacket sleeve. He straightened his posture, towering over his broken grandfather. He reached up and adjusted his silk tie, his expression mirroring the cold, lethal indifference I used in the courtroom. "Thanks for that $10,000 offer to pay my tuition," Jamal said, his voice echoing against the concrete pillars. "But Harvard Law just accepted my transfer with a full ride. Have a nice life." Jamal turned and walked down the marble courthouse steps, leaving Marcus Sr. and Yvonne frozen in the afternoon sun. They watched their grandson disappear into the crowd, taking their last ounce of hope. 2 months later, the justice system delivered its final blow. I sat in the back row of the federal courtroom, wearing a charcoal suit, watching the sentencing hearing conclude. DeAndre stood before the judge wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to his waist. His arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a ruined man. The judge handed down 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Lauren stood at the defense table weeping uncontrollably as her expensive lawyers failed to save her. Despite her wealthy father making frantic calls to every political contact he knew, the federal mandatory minimums were completely unforgiving. She received 8 years for her role in the money laundering conspiracy. As the federal marshals led them away in chains, Lauren looked back at the gallery, her mascara running down her face, finally understanding that her weaponized privilege was completely powerless against the cold, hard reality of federal law. I did not smile, and I did not gloat. I simply stood up, adjusted my briefcase, and walked out of the courtroom, closing that dark chapter of my life forever. The winter brought a harsh, freezing reality to the Vance family matriarch and patriarch. With their bank accounts permanently seized and their sprawling colonial mansion sold at a government auction to pay back the stolen church funds, Yvonne and Marcus Sr. were forced to relocate to the industrial outskirts of the city. Their new home was a cramped, decaying one-bedroom apartment situated above a noisy 24-hour laundromat. The heating radiator clanked loudly throughout the night, barely keeping the bitter chill out of the drafty rooms. The walls were thin, peeling with old paint, and the narrow windows looked out over an alleyway filled with overflowing trash cans. It was the exact same neighborhood, the exact same squalor, and the exact same suffocating desperation they had forced me into 20 years ago when they threw an 18-year-old pregnant girl out into the freezing snow. Marcus Sr. spent his days sitting in a frayed armchair, staring blankly at a small television, mourning the elite country club status he would never recover. Yvonne sat at a scratched Formica kitchen table, clutching a cold cup of cheap tea, listening to the rumbling washing machines downstairs. Her wealthy friends had all blocked her phone number, and the church congregation she used to rule had entirely erased her from their memory. They had spent their entire lives obsessing over their pristine public image, sacrificing their own daughter to maintain an illusion of perfection. Now they were left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own toxic pride, completely isolated in the very gutter they always claimed I belonged in. Far away from their miserable apartment, the spring air felt incredibly warm and welcoming. I stood on the newly repaired front porch of Grandma Hattie's heritage home, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. The splintered wood DeAndre had smashed with his sledgehammer was completely restored, painted a crisp, brilliant white that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. The manicured lawn stretched out toward the quiet, peaceful street, surrounded by blooming azalea bushes and the gentle shade of ancient oak trees. Jamal stepped out of the front door, letting the screen door click softly shut behind him. He was wearing a comfortable gray sweater, looking relaxed and happy. He had just finished his final round of exams for his first semester at Harvard Law, and the heavy burden of our family drama was completely lifted from his shoulders. He walked over to the wooden railing and stood beside me, looking out at the neighborhood. The sky was painting itself in vibrant shades of orange-pink and deep purple as the sun slowly began to set over the city. We did not need to speak right away. The silence between us was no longer filled with anxiety or the looming threat of my family's vicious attacks. It was a comfortable, victorious silence built on the solid foundation of truth and resilience. Jamal set a thick manila folder down on the small patio table between the wicker rocking chairs. He opened the folder, carefully smoothing out the crisp legal documents resting inside. These papers were not fraudulent eviction notices or forged wills. They were the final certified banking transfers authorized by the federal probate court. The entire estate, including the $780,000, was officially cleared and released into my name. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy gold fountain pen. I did not keep a single penny of that inherited money for myself. I leaned over the table and signed my name on the bottom line, officially transferring every single dollar of Grandma Hattie's inheritance into a newly established irrevocable trust fund. I named it the Hattie Vance Foundation for Displaced Teen Mothers. The money would be used exclusively to provide safe housing, professional legal advocacy, and full college scholarships for young women who were thrown away by their families, ensuring no other young girl would ever have to freeze in the dark like I did. Jamal smiled proudly, reaching over the small table to put his strong arm around my shoulders. He pulled me into a warm, comforting embrace, resting his chin on the top of my head. I leaned into my son, feeling the incredible strength of the family we had built together completely on our own terms. I looked down at the perfectly polished wood floors of the porch, the golden hour light reflecting beautifully off the smooth surface. "The stain is finally washed away," I said quietly, my voice steady and full of absolute peace. "Justice is the only true legacy we will ever leave behind." The core lesson embedded within this narrative is that biological relation does not automatically equate to genuine family. Blood may genetically connect people, but it absolutely does not excuse toxic behavior, emotional abuse, or systemic financial manipulation. Society frequently pressures individuals to forgive unforgivable transgressions, simply because the perpetrators happen to be relatives. However, enduring constant abuse, merely to protect a deeply flawed family legacy, is a destructive, soul-crushing sacrifice. True family is actively built on mutual respect, unconditional support, and unshakable integrity, not on superficial social status, country club memberships, or the relentless exploitation of the vulnerable. Another profound takeaway is the undeniable devastating power of silent and strategic preparation. The protagonist did not win her monumental battle through loud reactionary outbursts or desperate attempts to prove her worth to people committed to misunderstanding her. Instead, she quietly weaponized her own success, education, and intellect in the shadows. When you are constantly underestimated by arrogant abusers, the most effective response is never to argue your value. The ultimate strategy is to let your irrefutable achievements completely dismantle their false prejudice narratives. Authentic power does not ever need to announce itself loudly. It simply reveals itself precisely when the trap is fully set. Finally, the story powerfully illustrates that definitive justice is the ultimate form of closure. Forgiving those who display absolutely no remorse is not a mandatory requirement for personal healing. Sometimes true healing only comes from holding abusers strictly accountable to the law and severing toxic ties permanently. By transforming generational greed into a protective foundation for vulnerable youth, the narrative proves that the cycle of trauma can be permanently broken. The greatest revenge is building a beautiful life they can never touch. Subscribe to our channel to experience more thrilling audio stories of strategic payback, and share this video if you believe in standing up to toxic manipulation.